Afternoon and welcome to another Turnstile Tours program. I'm Stephen D.W. coming to you from the Lenape Lands, now known as Flushing. We'll be joined here in just a moment by Karen Imas, who's on the other side of Corona Park, and she will take us. We're going to go spend some time at the other side of the city in Staten Island. Before I get into it with Karen and we get into the resiliency story, I want to just review. This is a part two of programs that we've been doing about Staten Island's North Shore. And I just want to bring up some slides and sort of give you a little recap on what we talked about last time, nowhere near the depth that we went into last time. And just to give you an idea of exactly what the North Shore is, in fact. So here we are looking at Staten Island, and when we talk about the North Shore of Staten Island, Staten Islanders refer to the North Shore in sort of a special way. That is everything north of the expressway that you see running across from the two corners from the Verrazzano Narrows all the way over to the Goethals Bridge. So all that area is referred to as the North Shore, and then we have the South Shore looking down at the lower bay, while the Arthur Kill borders the West Shore looking at New Jersey. Today, we're going to look at a small part of the North Shore, just over here at the very east end of it. So our last program a month ago, we looked at the entire North Shore. We took a very quick tour from Howland Hook over on the west end and its salt marshes and container terminal through the marine industrial area along the Kilvan Cull by the Bayonne Bridge, and into that green area, Snug Harbor, which has become a cultural center, former retired sailors' home. And then as we round the corner at the ferry, top of that blue line is very important. That's the Staten Island Railroad. And you can see that it's a little bit inland from the shore. So we had an industrial area that the Staten Island Railroad used to be a B&O railroad that went all the way over to New Jersey, north of the Goethals Bridge. That North Shore Railroad is still visible in remnants. Part of it's been revived, serving Howland Hook, the container terminal, but the MTA has designs on a lot of the old right-of-way to make it a bus rapid transit, but it's in pretty derelict shape at the moment. But that blue line you see is the Staten Island Railroad, formerly that B&O railroad line. And you can see it's a little bit inland. That stretch of land between the Staten Island Railroad and the water was heavily industrialized, going up to the Staten Island ferry terminal, and used to be piers and factories in the late 19th, early 20th century. And there's still some marine infrastructure there. Miller's Launch, the tugboat company, is based there. But there's also a lot of opportunity for development. The Navy had a home port in that stretch, and we have a lot of open space. If we can go a couple slides forward, Andrew, we've got so this is looking over at Howland Hook with the salt marshes and the container terminal. And we're going to go toward the end of the slideshow. Here we got our marine industrial complex with the Cadell Dry Dock and McAllister Towing. So this is a lot of what, and I'm sure Karen will show us photos that look like this as well, but this is a really important part and demonstrative of what we're going to, representative of what we're going to look at today. Former industrial space got hit pretty hard by Sandy, even though it's not this neighborhood's not super low lying. It does rise up pretty quickly from the shore, but right at the shore, it was mostly paved, separated from the railroad, by the railroad from the rest of the island and the housing. And this particular spot that we're in Clifton, this was where Commodore Vanderbilt, the Cornelius Vanderbilt, the founder of that fortune, started out his first business as a ferryman. This was his launch for his ferry boat. It was right here at the end of Vanderbilt Avenue in Staten Island. But you can see buildings in the distance in varying degrees of use right now, and lots of opportunities for development, a lot of interest in developing this area. And so I can't, for those of you who didn't catch our program last time, do go check that out. for more details on all of this space. But I'm going to give it over to bring in Karen rather to tell us about what we can expect to see in this area, the issues around how this is going to develop, and also why we're talking to you, Karen. You're here from Waterfront Alliance. It's good to see you. As a former colleague, I worked at Waterfront Alliance for a little while a few years ago, and it's great to have you back. But why don't you tell us a bit about who you are and why you're here and what Waterfront Alliance is and does?
Great. Thank you so much, Stefan. It's great to see you, and thank you for the invitation and for that super interesting introduction. And thanks a lot to Turnstile Tours for the invitation to present today. I'm going to share a few slides with you momentarily. So as Stefan mentioned, my name is Karen Imas. I work with Waterfront Alliance. I'm their Vice President of Programs, and I'm a Queens resident, landlocked in Central Queens, but a lover of all things waterfront. And one of the joys of this work is getting to visit different parts of New York City's waterfront that are underexplored, sometimes less noticed, and that have so much interesting potential and mixed uses happening. And this project in Staten Island that I'll share with you a little bit about today is definitely one of those slices of New York City where there's perhaps a little bit of underappreciated and undervisible piece of waterfront. So just a little bit of background, taking a step back for a moment and looking more at the citywide picture. So who is Waterfront Alliance? We're a New York, New Jersey-based advocacy organization that inspires and affects resilient and revitalized waterfronts, accessible coastlines for all communities. And as Stefan said, we're all about connecting New Yorkers to their local waterfronts. And I'll get a little bit into more about how we do that through different programs. Brief history here that most of you probably know. Our waterfronts have rapidly changed over the hundreds of years of New York's history. From Stefan mentioned we're here on Lenape lands, and this is a snapshot of what New York or Manhattan Island probably looked like several hundred years ago. Moving forward in time, sort of post-colonialism and the maritime capital that Manhattan became, with so much traffic on the waterways that we're increasingly seeing return to New York, but certainly not in the capacity that it was way back then, before the bridges and the tunnels and just all the maritime commerce. And fast forward again, looking at a lot of that pier infrastructure and maritime infrastructure and economic activity that left New York City and moved to the port in New Jersey and elsewhere, left us with a post-industrial waterfront that while does not look like this in most places anymore, there's still many gaps where waterfront maritime infrastructure is really lacking and needs capital investment.
And Karen, may I ask, I don't recall, are you originally from the city yourself?
Oh, myself? So I am a Queens native, almost. I was actually born in Ukraine, but arrived here as a very young child. So for all intents and purposes, a Queens girl.
So I don't assume that you're old enough to remember the post-industrial waterfront, but do you have memories of the post-industrial waterfront in New York?
Yeah, I mean, I think, growing up in Central Queens, I wasn't so geographically close to that. But, I think like going into Manhattan as a child, anything west of 8th Avenue was sort of like not to say obviously there were people living there and there was activity, but it looked like this, in the 80s, and not anywhere that I was visiting with my family as a kid. Later I actually went to high school in Lower Manhattan. And at that point, seeing like Battery Park City and the West Side, West Side Highway and the West Side Park start to take shape was really eye-opening, because it was almost like happening in real time. Right. I think it's obviously opened up so many new areas and opportunities for New Yorkers. but yes, as a kid, like Long Island City is a great example. I mean, I was in Queens, not that far away from Long Island City, but going there for any reason was not on the map, so to
Right.
speak.
No,
Yeah.
I'm a native of Staten Island myself. I didn't grow up there, but I spent enough time there to remember it, make an impression. Went to school in the Staten Island Ferry, and aside from that area right by the ferry, a lot of Staten Island's waterfront today doesn't look that different from what it did in the 70s and 80s. There's, of course, we have the ballpark right by the ferry, which is being revived now, but you get a little bit away from it, and like we mentioned at the top, on the west side, it's still vital industry, but on the east side, it looks not too different from what you're talking about here. I'm sure you'll get more into that, but that's a striking contrast from what you talk about seeing in real time in Long Island City and the west side.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Stefan. I think the snapshot of Staten Island, especially in the pocket that we're going to discuss, does look like this in a lot of places still. And there's I think one of the things that we got into in our study was the fact that you have public parcels and you have private parcels, and the challenges and opportunities of making certain kinds of changes with sometimes private landowners that may own a lot or own a building, but choose to just kind of sit on it for longer periods of time, and what happens at the water's edge as a result of that. So let me continue on here. Again, just little snapshots in time of limited access starting to open up with different walkways, more natural places to visit, but still quite limited. And then, again, seeing what we call Esplanadia, which was getting New Yorkers to the water's edge, but getting a vista, basically, which was the concrete walkway, which we still also have plenty of in the city today. And Waterfront Alliance has been really working towards getting to this vision. Mixed uses, high functioning waterfronts that include climate resilient measures, marrying these with public access and economic activity. And so snapshots here show kayaking under the Brooklyn Bridge, the growth of the ferry system, and more natural shoreline features like the one seen here in the lower left in Long Island City. And again, recognizing that many parts of the city still do not have features like this, and working towards getting there.
Well, we did talk
again, Waterfront Alliance.
A great one in Staten Island. We have the new Richmond Terrace Park on the western end of the North Shore, which doesn't have significant impediments to the waterfront. It's not the most inviting water, but it's not that Esplanadia that you're talking about. So we're making progress.
I think that's really important to acknowledge where we can make that progress and where we're seeing it. And a lot of that is a result of also community voices coming to the table and recognizing that they would like real access to the water, putting their feet in the water, putting a boat in the water, having more natural features that can contribute to bigger holistic things like green infrastructure or reducing heat island effect, and recognizing now that how you design at the water's edge, even if it's a small pocket park or a big park, can have these broader implications. And we at Waterfront Alliance, we're learning from a 1,000+ partners, right? Hearing community voices in places like Staten Island and Queens and elsewhere, people who row, people who design, groups that work in the maritime industry, weighing in with their good input and influence. So I'll run really quickly through, again, how we sort of articulate this as an organization. We have advocacy priorities in different buckets, which include climate resilience, obviously so critical now, and risks only increasing, especially with sea level rise projections. Open harbor and public access, which I'll be talking a lot about today. And here, I just want to mention that one of the things that we do are these feasibility studies and maritime activation plans for different geographies across the city. We've just completed one a while back on Governor's Island, and looking at how to maximize this long stretch of water's edge and reduce the Esplanadia and bring more public programming, more climate resilience. And this is similar to what we've done with the Staten Island report that I'll get into momentarily. We have a lot of educational programming at the Water's Edge that we do as an organization, and obviously having a good, resilient, accessible design at the Water's Edge helps with public programming, right? If you want young people at local schools or local organizations to experience their local waterfronts, to participate in citizen science, you need the access, you need to make it inviting, you need natural features. And so it all really ties together. And again, here we have the working harbor and maritime industry, which is very prevalent in Staten Island. And this is a really important part of the discussion because we want to acknowledge that there is an economically viable and strong maritime history and maritime sector currently operating in Staten Island. It's a job driver. But we're also thinking about, what does the 21st century maritime sector look like? Sustainable, resilient, more open to the public in the sense of removing this sort of shroud of mystery of what's happening in the working waterfront and sharing the stories with local communities. So here I'll get into the study more specifically, and actually I'm going to drop the, I'm going to drop the link to the study in the chat that you can, oh, is it in there already? Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So so let me just walk through a little bit about how this started. So as I mentioned, we do these maritime activation plans. We do different resiliency studies, and we looked at basically stretches across New York City that we felt, again, didn't really have the visibility that we think was important. This particular stretch, which you can see on the map here from basically what is Clifton Station down to Fort Wadsworth, is south of the Stapleton waterfront and the Bay Street rezoning, which has been a big effort to reshape the waterfront. And then down south, you have the National Park Service. And this 1.5 mile stretch has private parcels, public parcels, it has historic sites, it has working waterfront, it has a few access points, it has some elevated cliffs, so a real mix of different kinds of structures, but what I would say is very disconnected, disconnected from a perspective of just like straight connectivity, but also the different uses. Really, there has not been a comprehensive look at how this is all working together. And we heard from community stakeholders that we talked to that this kind of comprehensive planning was really lacking, that different things were popping up along the water's edge, and the community did not feel invested in how some of these outcomes were coming about. And we held a number of public workshops and conversations around this particular stretch of waterfront, which, by the way, has some of the most beautiful views from that part of Staten Island, of the Verrazzano, of Manhattan, of the harbor. It's really fantastic to get out there and actually see it.
If you haven't been to the Alice Austin House, that's absolute must do. It's one of my favorite cultural sites in that stretch of waterfront.
Absolutely, and I'll comment on the Alice Austin House momentarily. So again, as I mentioned, our report, it was split into 5 different sections. The first being comprehensive community-centered planning and advocacy. And this gets into land use processes in New York City more broadly, about how local individuals and groups are engaged early in planning processes when there are land use hearings at the community board level, or when city agencies come to a community to start early, to start these conversations, not sort of at the tail end of an already baked idea, to really make an effort to reach out to different groups that don't usually come to community board meetings, and to engage local businesses in the planning efforts. And it was interesting, we had a lot of testimonials from different groups. In this case, it was the head of the Chamber of Commerce who pointed out that, even businesses see this corridor as a missed opportunity right now, because with this kind of stretch of waterfront, there clearly could be more economic viability, more opportunities, more foot traffic, and the sort of starts and stops with the development projects have put up a barrier really to realizing these kinds of efforts. The next slide continues this, and we actually had a really cool group from the Brooklyn Art Incubator participating in our public workshops and sort of sketching out what they heard people talking about, which was kind of neat to, have this vision realized when people talk about fishing and swimming and celebrating the community's sort of nautical history. Somebody made the interesting comment that you have all of these streets named after kind of like nautical themes along this stretch, but you're really not engaging with the waterfront that much. And really being able to realize that more. And so this is kind of a dream vision, but again, we are seeing some of these features realized in different parts of the city with more human-powered boating and get downs and wetland restoration, boat houses, and then upland connectivity, view corridors that this mile-and-a-half stretch would really benefit from. And with respect to connectivity, you have Front Street there, Edgewater and Front Streets, which are kind of designed to facilitate a lot of truck traffic because of some of the maritime uses. And in some places, you don't even have a curb to walk on. And it's hard to navigate traffic there a little bit, whether you're walking or biking or even just driving. And so, for sort of DOT to flag, what does this look like if somebody's actually coming off the ferry and perhaps trying to walk or bike down to Fort Wadsworth? You hit this patch south of Stapleton that becomes actually really hard to navigate. So studying the Edgewater and Front Street corridors through DOT is a priority recommendation of this study. But also, it always helps to have more visibility for a corridor. And right now, like there's no bike share in Staten Island. And so, even just getting folks from the ferry to be able to get down to Fort Wadsworth and reintroducing that kind of bike share would help to bring attention to this corridor. We're also thinking about connectivity the other way, right? If you're going to, how do you get to Fort Wadsworth, right? I mean, it's really by car, maybe by bus or, some public transit within Staten Island. But there are sort of older piers right now in sort of derelict state at Fort Wadsworth that could potentially accommodate visiting ferries, periodically on weekends, piloting a ferry that could get to Fort Wadsworth more from the southern end of this corridor. And we've spoken to National Park Service as part of these recommendations about the kinds of investments that might help to facilitate some of these structures. Another category in our report focuses on education, cultural, and historical programming. I think, Stefan mentioned Alice Austin House. One of the most interesting things for me about this corridor was just all of the history captured in this mile-and-a-half stretch. The Alice Austin House features the work of one of the preeminent women photographers in the country. The Vanderbilt story, which I was not familiar with, about the ferry, which is fantastic history. There's a great deal of African-American abolitionist history in this corridor as well. And even just having historic sites with markers is very meaningful and creates a destination or a corridor. There are local Staten Island groups like the Staten Island Urban Center that has been championing the creation of a maritime education and recreational corridor that ties different programming together and different historical contexts together. And we think in this report that that's really meaningful because it does create a narrative and does give the community more ownership over what's happening in this corridor and telling its historical story. So even just elevating public programming, and this is something that Waterfront Alliance does work on more from an environmental education point of view, but trying to elevate the kind of educational and public programming that's taking place in this corridor to tell some of these stories and to tie some of these narratives together. Public open space and in-water recreation is another one of our sections. There's a lot here to dig into. The Parks Department overall in the city is grossly underfunded. And so that is a larger sort of advocacy effort that Waterfront Alliance has been involved in, Right now, the city budget for parks is about 0.6% of the city budget. So there are a lot of efforts underway to get to 1% for parks, and that is in the next city budget. And so that's something that we've been championing a lot with other advocacy organizations. Requirements to maintain and create public access are really important because private parcels and private developments across the city are creating publicly accessible private space. But what that space looks like can really dramatically vary. And so as an advocacy organization and working with local groups, advocating for the best possible outcomes. The other thing that's worth noting, and the picture here is actually a snapshot of the same parking lot that Stefan showed earlier on, is a particular city-owned property near the Clifton railway station. And there's quite a lot of city-owned property across the city that what we would define as underutilized waterfront property. In this case, it's a parking lot. But what we've seen is because it has this kind of like get down sort of kind of waterfront, folks are bringing kayaks. We know that Kayak Staten Island, which is a great group, has done some programming there, but it's really not set up for that kind of public programming. The community is taking ownership of it, which is fantastic. And these are exactly the kinds of sites that should be transferred in terms of jurisdiction to become actually mapped open space, whether it's through parks or other agencies or public-private efforts, so that they can become dedicated open space. And this particular site, the DCAS parking lot, is a priority site for Waterfront Alliance in terms of our engagement with the city and with council members and the mayor's office.
That's such an excellent point. You know, so often we look at a space and it seems abandoned, but it's just not being used in ways that we sort of expect or understand or designed for that. When I took that photo, I was surrounded by people fishing and sort of making a park space for their family, just enjoying the waterfront. And then behind me, there was a film shoot happening. So it was actually a very active space. It was kind of hard to get a shot that wasn't full of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, community ownership over a site like this is so important, and that's part of the I think advocacy story that we want to tell, that the community is already bringing programming and activity here, and creating safer, cleaner, more green space for the community where they're already bringing their own resources. We see community groups doing cleanups at sites like this and doing plantings. So sort of meeting the community in the middle and saying, we can do something with this site is I think really, really important. And it's geographically positioned, again, just south of that Stapleton waterfront. So from a community connectivity point of view, it makes a lot of sense as well.
I do have one other question about this. So
Sure.
It's very clear from experiencing that area that, unsurprisingly for Staten Island, it's locals who are engaging with it, and because of Staten Island, they're engaging by car. And there's this barrier that I talked about at the beginning of the train. Did your study look particularly at all at that barrier and ways for using the train or getting around the train tracks or using the train stations as a corridor rather than a barrier?
Yeah, that's interesting. We really didn't do a deep dive into the train as much, although, the Staten Island Railroad, I think, does help people get to a certain point along the water's edge, but then there's a limitation to, where they can go. I mean, look, I think, mass transit options like the railroad are an asset. I think, helping to make them more kind of hubs in different areas is also important. And I think for Staten Island, multimodal is really essential. Like, could you do the bike share at a Staten Island Railroad station, right? In addition to the ferry. I mean, I think those kinds of connections are sort of what we've been thinking about in the context of this report.
Absolutely, thanks.
So a couple of just more points here. We have two more chapters: economic and workforce development. Again, really important to the future of the maritime sector here. We do recognize it's, again, active economy and recognizing that, you know, there's a lot of infrastructure that goes into successful operations, bulkheads, deep water at piers, dredging, and the potential to expand job and training opportunities for the local community. I think, you know, one of the challenges, and we see a lot of opportunity here, but I think one of the challenges is often from the public a bit of a disconnect with what's happening at the water's edge in terms of the working waterfront. And we think a lot about what could public access look like in the context of working waterfront. And that's, I think, a complicated question, because we recognize that there are sensitive industrial needs. Sometimes it's homeland security, sometimes it's heavy machinery, and you know, just sensitivity to what the public can do at the water's edge. But we also feel that, you know, public access, and this was articulated a lot through this report and through the public workshops, public access could mean learning opportunities at some of these sites. So places like Sandy Hook Pilots and the Coast Guard Station do sometimes facilitate public tours or public visits. I think it tends to be occasionally with school groups, so it's, you know, pretty limited. But the more opportunities we could open for engagement of that sort with the maritime sector does kind of lift the shroud of mystery in terms of what's happening, helps, you know, to make the case for different kinds of infrastructure investments so the facilities can be improved for operations, can help with internship opportunities. And I think it's also important to kind of look forward and recognize that there are a lot of sustainability opportunities here as well for future electrification projects, supporting vessels that can, you know, plug in, bringing, you know, things like electric trucks to some of these facilities. We've actually seen some of that, for example, at Red Hook terminals in Brooklyn. So we are very much, I think, in this report acknowledging that we want to see a successful and viable maritime sector that's more holistically integrated into the community. And finally, the climate resilience and edge strategies, which, you know, frankly underlie, you know, everything, because with the risk of you know, kind of really two things happening: sea level rise and storm surge, which affect this corridor. Erosion is a significant concern in this area. And again, you're running into, you know, public parcels and private parcels. So making sure that there are resiliency strategies for building better infrastructure in this stretch. Waterfront Alliance has a tool called the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, which informs, it's sort of a rating system for projects at the water's edge, and it tries to inform the best possible outcome. So whether it's, say, rebuilding this parking lot or a housing at the water's edge or an industrial site, we do have this rating system of metrics that can help score a project and deliver outcomes that include things like natural shoreline or stronger, you know, stronger design to elevate or set back. And it's interesting because in this particular quote, I think the chair of the Waterfront Committee for Staten Island CB1 articulated this really well, because he said, you're here along this stretch of amazing waterfront. You see the Verrazzano Bridge, you see Lower Manhattan. It's like this iconic, amazing place, but it's not filled with thriving businesses and people, because the potential here is lacking because of some very basic infrastructure. The water's edge has a lot of infrastructure needs. And so capital investments, public, private dollars to help reform this waterfront are going to be very much needed in the future. And I think that's about it for me. So I'll stop there. Encourage you to read the report, and I'll just leave you with this, that we did a lot of this synthesis with the community and reporting out, and the next step for us with a changing mayor and a changing council is to put this in front of decision makers and try to really action some of these recommendations.
So, Karen, I just want to take a few minutes. Thank you very much for that introduction to the work that Waterfront Alliance has done here. It brought up a lot of issues I want to get into and invite more questions from the audience while we have you with us. But I want to go back to the wedge thing that you were talking about here, this Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines. So if I want to understand and make sure our audience understands what you're talking about here, would it be appropriate to talk about that as kind of a LEED, the rating system for buildings? You get like a platinum LEED building, or that they have they're more efficient, than they handle water. We've talked about this in other programs about buildings that are ecologically better than the others, new works or old buildings even. So is WEDG kind of like LEED in that way?
Yeah, in some ways it is. I think it's comparable. There are multiple rating systems that exist out there now for different kinds of sustainable and resilient infrastructure. A LEED sort of set the standard early on and has really reshaped building standards for sustainability. There's other rating systems for environmental standards overall called Envision. There's one called WELL that deals with sort of like public health in a building. And WEDG was developed with the same sort of approach in mind, to rate, but also to try to drive certain outcomes in waterfront projects. And it's a holistic rating system in the sense that it looks at coastal resilient design, but it also looks at public access and how it's being created, and also looking at how the community was engaged in the process. One of our WEDG verified projects is Sandy Hook Pilots, which is in this particular stretch of waterfront, and it was rebuilt. It got badly damaged during Hurricane Sandy, and it was rebuilt to be basically more protected. It's elevated higher, it's set back, it uses certain kinds of materials, it uses certain kinds of permeable pavement type of materials. And we've actually increasingly seen industrial sites be able to score well on the WEDG guidelines by, for example, even doing things like wetland restoration alongside an industrial project, or creating a public pathway around the site at the water's edge. There's often this view that, you really can't create any kind of public access around an industrial site. But we're increasingly starting to see interest in that. And so WEDG can inform a lot of great outcomes. Just as a quick snapshot, we typically work with either the developer or the city agency. We look at concept plans early on. We're able to provide some feedback, and then we score the final construction documents. And we try to make the case for, maritime activity. We try to make the case for natural shorelines. And we recognize no one project scores perfectly across all of these metrics. But through this process, we are able to come, I think, to some better outcomes across the water's edge, and more sort of, I think, standardization when we start to see these outcomes in a lot of different places. And I think, for something like WEDG, getting it more codified in some way is a great next step. We have seen it pop up in things like the Port Authority Sustainable Infrastructure Guidelines, and different RFPs for major projects. So in kind of voluntary capacity, it shows up a lot, but LEED became incentivized through tax credits, and then it became mandated through law. And eventually, having this kind of set of climate resilient guidelines for the water's edge or for the floodplain would be, I think, an asset to communities and to building owners in the city for risk reduction purposes.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of concern about the waterfront in Staten Island, and you mentioned Sandy a couple times. Of course, this stretch of waterfront was hit very hard by Sandy. There was famously a couple of ships that washed up on the shore. One, a 1930s oil tanker, is sort of a cousin or a sibling of the one at Portside, New York, over in Red Hook. But when we think of Sandy and Staten Island, we spend a lot of time thinking about the South Shore that we pointed it to on that map initially. Those old wetlands, these old salt marshes that just were built up and with residences and just got hammered by this. But more recently, there's other wetlands on the other side, closer to where we started our conversation about the North Shore in Old Place and Graniteville, have gotten a lot of attention because there's been development there. I don't know how familiar you are with some of the development that's been happening in Graniteville, but we had one of our viewers who was interested in knowing more. I wonder if you can comment on the situation over there.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it's definitely a situation that at Waterfront Alliance we've been monitoring. And you're right, it is outside the study area for this project, but more broadly speaking, wetland protection and wetland restoration in New York City is a major priority for our organization moving forward at the city and state level. Graniteville, this is, from what I understand, it's at a juncture now where things are already moving with the development of what I believe is the big box store. And I think there are so many gaps in city and state policy that let this get to this point. Freshwater wetlands have not been mapped by the New York State DEC in like 40 plus years. There's some legislative efforts underway in Albany to protect smaller parcels of wetlands that fall through the cracks in terms of federal protections. And then the Waterfront Revitalization Program in New York, which permits some of these types of projects, also goes through revisions every couple of years and can create certain designations for certain kinds of ecologically sensitive areas to protect them from this kind of development. So I don't have a comment just specifically on what's happening now with Graniteville, because I understand that things are kind of moving. But I also think that it's really unfortunate that it got to this point, because from what I understand it, Hurricane Ida, the wetlands protect from some of those impacts, and to lose that, and then to lose the more broader ecology, because the Graniteville swamp and the wetlands connect through tributaries to other wetlands in Staten Island, and so the kind of domino impacts are going to be felt. And I think, just broadly speaking, there really needs to be a whole rethinking of ecology and nature in the city. There's a great report by Natural Areas Conservancy called the Wetlands Management Framework, which was released very recently, and would definitely encourage people to take a look at that, because there are, these are not nice to haves, but, must haves to protect wetlands for the future.
I'm so glad you brought up Ida. I also work at the Waterfront Museum, which is this 107-year-old barge that rode out Sandy, and people always want to know about Sandy, and then they ask about Ida. And we're always telling them there that Sandy was an event that inland New York didn't experience, because it was all about the places that we've put landfill that used to be water. They used to be salt water, and Ida was not something we experienced at the Waterfront Museum, because it was all about where there was fresh water. And you can't separate these things, but we also can't ignore them. And they're I hope that, unfortunately, it took Ida to bring some attention to this, but I hope the experience of Ida will show how expensive it is to ignore our freshwater waterfronts as well as our saltwater waterfronts. We've got some people chiming in the chat about who are very enthusiastic about these issues and looking at constitutional claims and rights for clean water. So it sounds like we're all kind of on the same page here. And it's just a matter of what we do and how we can make these things happen. I know, if I recall correctly, Waterfront Alliance also looked at the other end of the city. And did you do a similar report on Soundview? Do I recall that correctly?
Actually, we hadn't done one on Soundview. We did one on Governor's Island and Brooklyn Bridge Park. Soundview, we were engaged in more on the ferry infrastructure side of things. But I will say that on Governor's Island, for example, there's a big rezoning and master planning effort going on there. And we did a similar kind of analysis, again, pointing to where you essentially have a concrete walkway around the island and maybe one or two small kind of get down opportunities. And it's interesting because we see a lot of opportunity there in establishing a climate research center, but not to have natural features and more public access while establishing a climate research center is sort of a disconnect. So again, making the case for those kinds of improvements and for ferry infrastructure investments as well. And I'll just add there, on the ferry, again, going back to the Fort Wadsworth, which, is actually one of my favorite places in the city. And I sort of discovered it much later in my life here in New York, as sometimes Queens and Staten Island can seem like completely different worlds. But since I discovered it, I've been out there many times, and especially during this study period, and, drawing some corollaries to a place like Governor's Island and, all of the people that have discovered Governor's Island for its recreation and its history. And how do we leverage Fort Wadsworth in the same way? Such incredible history, such incredible structures, beautiful open spaces, hard to get to, underutilized. And some of that ferry infrastructure, I think, would be just a real win-win in getting folks over there.
And of course, if you want to stay in Queens, you also have Fort Totten, which seems like cognate to Fort Wadsworth. So do you, I don't know if this is something that you have an answer to or can talk about, but what's next? What for you would be the next place that you'd want to study like this in New York City?
Oh, wow. That is a great question. We've done these kinds of assessments both proactively and reactively, meaning we're occasionally as an organization approached by other organizations to take on one of these studies. So we're always open to ideas from different civic groups or parks trusts or parks conservancies to do this kind of work. But we're also sometimes looking at, blank slates and, seeing what's possible. It's a good question. I think, there are parts of the Bronx waterfront that I think, merit this kind of attention around Mott Haven, the South Bronx, Soundview, Ferry Point Park. And it actually dovetails a little bit with a similar project we have currently underway, not yet completed, which is looking at city-owned public sites that are underutilized, like that DCAS parking lot that we highlighted, and identifying maybe 5 sites like this across the city that would lend themselves to community engagement and advocacy efforts, and looking then at funding models and implementation models for making them real open space. And I think it's important to recognize that we often think about like, all right, well, let's just transfer jurisdiction to the Parks Department and it'll become NYC Parks. But that's not always perhaps the most realistic model. As I said, like the parks budget, they're underfunded, they're understaffed, they're doing amazing work, but the resources right now still need to be championed. And I think there's definitely a case to be made for that, but it's also important to look at like what other innovative models are out there. DEP helped to fund this Newtown Creek Marsh Nature Walk around the wastewater treatment plant there. And if you haven't been out there in Greenpoint.
Beautiful space. Everyone's very excited about it. Yeah.
Amazing. And, are we looking at DEP, which also is in charge of, a lot of green infrastructure, kind of again, marrying those different priorities and seeing where it makes sense to transfer jurisdiction. And also in some cases, leveraging, local, like private entities that operate, you have like different warehouses or, companies that have a big nearby presence, and whether they can make those kinds of investments to support that. So I see there's a comment actually in the chat about Hart Island.
Yeah.
And the transfer to parks. And, again, right, like making the case that if a place like Hart Island is going to be, public access, and obviously there's sensitivities to the cemetery there, but making sure that it's created in a way that is, maintained well and provides real public access to the community.
So with a place like Clifton and this sort of accidental playground kind of a space where people are using it and it has a life in the community, it's just kind of unsightly and a little unsafe. what, if it's not easy to, if we don't want to transfer it to parks because they're overburdened and there isn't necessarily an obvious other organization to bring in to put the money in to invest in maintaining it, what's wrong with allowing it to persist as it is?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, we know that Kayak Staten Island, for example, has actively been using it with programming, and there may be what I would say like kind of low-hanging fruit steps, like for example, putting a storage container there so kayaks can be stored. And you don't necessarily have to transfer jurisdiction right at this moment, but you can create public access that provides for a little more safety and a little more activity and ownership. And I think those kinds of things matter a lot. But I also think there's different ways to look at these sites, and I know other groups are doing really good work at looking at funding models, like creating sort of a bid-like system for parks investments or public-private partnerships. And so I think jurisdiction transfer to parks should be on the table, but we should also be looking at what are other ways to support, potential activation of these sites. And again, maybe starting with some steps initially. Waterfront Alliance has, for example, done that. Just to give you a quick snapshot, Brooklyn Bridge Beach, which is under the Brooklyn Bridge on the Manhattan side, which is EDC property. We've done some public programming there, opening it periodically for kayaking and for City of Water Day festival that we do annually. Now, with some of the resiliency projects happening on the east side of Manhattan there, it will become, hopefully, if all stays on track, a perpetual open public access space. So sometimes it's a little bit like getting the programming more activated and more open and putting in some of that periodic infrastructure before eventual, full activation.
That makes a lot of sense. I think we have time for one last question or comment here. Gabriella says, with climate change, we'll continue to have flooding from now on. We were told that we can't have a blue belt because we have a stormwater system. It didn't work when we were flooded. I don't know if you can speak to that comment, but blue belts are definitely a big issue that we seem to keep coming up in the conversations around waterfront.
Yeah, I from what I understand, Staten Island, but not at the North Shore, has blue belt, and so we didn't do a total deep dive into that in this report. But I would say again, I think right now with changing council members, changing administration, potential new leadership at DEP, there's and a renewed, I think, focus on green infrastructure, and helping to really make that a priority in the city budget. I think there's a renewed opportunity to restart some of these conversations.
Well, I think this is one piece of that, and I know you're going to keep having this conversation about this particular study with other groups in the future. So we'll look forward to seeing this conversation move forward, and really appreciate your spending some time with us to discuss these topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. And also just really want to acknowledge a lot of the input and work of local Staten Islanders and local Staten Island community groups in informing this report, and just the importance of continuing to elevate local voices in all of these advocacy efforts. Waterfront Alliance is a citywide group, and we're hyper sensitive to and care about making sure that when we articulate these kinds of feasibility studies that we're really working with the community to put these interests front and center. So thanks for the opportunity, and to you, Stefan, and to Turnstile Tours as well.
Thank you for joining us, both Karen and everyone else. And we'll look forward to seeing you very soon we're looking at those stair streets of New York, another sort of out of the way place, and another hidden side of our city. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Take care, everyone.
Take care.